America's southeastern coastline is no stranger to hurricanes. Each year, the brutal winds and rains tear through cities and small towns, leaving behind nothing but destruction. But one hurricane stands apart from the rest. It wasn't just another storm. It was the beginning of something much darker, a curse that would haunt the survivors for generations. In the small town of Clearwater Bay, nestled along the Gulf Coast, locals believed they'd seen it all. From the powerful storms of the 19th century to the modern-day hurricanes, they knew how to survive. But when Hurricane Fury struck, it was unlike anything they'd ever experienced. What started as a typical storm turned into something far more sinister, something that took more than just lives. The summer of 1995 was particularly hot even for the Gulf Coast. Clearwater Bay, a town known for its resilience, went about its business despite the growing heat. The townspeople knew the drill. Hurricane season was on its way. Every year they boarded up windows, stocked up on supplies, and waited. But this time something felt different. The weather reports predicted a hurricane, but no one was particularly worried at first. Hurricanes came and went, but the town always stood strong. Yet as Hurricane Fury approached, the air grew heavy with unease. The wind didn't pick up right away. Instead, there was an eerie calm that settled over Clearwater Bay. Old-timers said it was the quiet before the storm, but it felt like something else, something watching, waiting. Mrs. Dunmore, an elderly woman who'd lived through more hurricanes than anyone in town, sat on her porch muttering to herself. She'd always been a little odd, but this time her whispers carried a note of real fear. "It's not the storm," she kept saying. "It's what comes after." As the days passed, strange things started happening. Birds flew inland in frantic waves, animals fled the forests, and at night, townsfolk swore they could hear strange voices carried on the wind. The skies remained clear, but everyone could feel the storm brewing, something far worse than just wind and rain. When Hurricane Fury finally arrived, it came with all the fury of nature unleashed. The winds howled like wild beasts, tearing apart homes and tossing debris through the air. The ocean surged violently, swallowing the coastline as if the waters themselves were alive. But amidst the chaos, something unnatural stirred. As the storm raged, those huddled in their homes heard more than just the wind and rain. Cries for help echoed through the storm, cries from the ocean. Joe, a local fisherman, swore he saw figures in the floodwaters, pale and ghastly, reaching out as if trying to escape the depths. He dismissed it at first, thinking it was his mind playing tricks, but the faces kept coming, beckoning as the floodwaters rose higher. Some people in town went missing that night, swept away by the flood, but others, they disappeared under stranger circumstances. Mary Lacey, who lived near the water, was last seen staring out of her window, transfixed by the storm. The next morning, her house was found empty, the floor soaked with seawater, though the water line had never reached her home. And then there were the whispers, faint, unintelligible, but there nonetheless. Voices calling from the depths, growing louder as the storm intensified. By the time Hurricane Fury reached its peak, it was clear to everyone this was no ordinary hurricane. Something ancient had awakened in the storm. When the storm finally passed, Clearwater Bay was left in ruins. Homes were destroyed, streets flooded, and the town's population had been cut in half. But for those who survived, the true horror was only beginning. In the days after Hurricane Fury, strange phenomena gripped the town. The floodwaters refused to recede, and bodies of the missing were nowhere to be found. Survivors reported eerie visions, shadows moving through their homes at night, faces appearing in mirrors for a split second before vanishing, and footsteps echoing in empty rooms. Joe the fisherman couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the same whispers he'd heard during the storm. But now they were clearer. "Come to the water," they said. "We're waiting." As more survivors began to disappear, it became apparent that something had been left behind by the hurricane. The waters that had flooded Clearwater Bay weren't just salt water from the Gulf. They were cursed, carrying with them the souls of those long lost at sea, those who had drowned in past storms, betrayed by the town's ancestors during a dark chapter of its history. The survivors lived in constant fear. Every night they heard knocks on their doors, 3 soft taps, always at midnight, but no one was ever there. And every night more people disappeared. The story of Clearwater Bay's curse dates back to the late 1800s, when the town was still young. A terrible hurricane had struck the region, and in the chaos, a group of sailors from a nearby shipwreck had come ashore seeking refuge. Desperate and injured, they begged the townsfolk for help, but fearing they couldn't spare their own supplies, the townspeople turned the sailors away. Left with nowhere to go, the sailors were swept back into the sea as the storm intensified. their cries for help lost in the wind. Legend has it that the sailors cursed the town with their dying breaths, vowing to return with the next great storm and claim the lives of those who had forsaken them. Mrs. Dunmore, the old woman who'd lived through it all, was the last to remember the story. She had tried to warn the town, but no one had listened. Now, as the bodies continued to disappear, she knew the truth. Hurricane Fury hadn't been just a storm. It was a vessel for the souls of the drowned, come back to take what they were owed. The water won't stop, Mrs. Dunmore warned. Not until they've taken enough. Not until their souls are at peace. In the following weeks, Clearwater Bay became a ghost town in every sense of the word. Those who remained were haunted by the spirits of the drowned. Each night, the floodwaters crept closer to their homes, even though the storm had long since passed. The sea, it seemed, wanted to reclaim the town. People began to see the spirits more clearly now, pale figures standing in the shadows, eyes wide with hunger. They weren't violent, at least not yet, but their presence was a constant, gnawing terror. They waited, watching the living, knowing their time would come. One by one, the survivors succumbed to the curse. Some disappeared without a trace, while others were found drowned in their own homes, their faces frozen in terror, as if they had seen something far worse than death. In the following weeks, Clearwater Bay became a ghost town in every sense of the word. Those who remained were haunted by the spirits of the drowned. Each night, the floodwaters crept closer to their homes, even though the storm had long since passed. The sea, it seemed, wanted to reclaim the town. People began to see the spirits more clearly now, pale figures standing in the shadows, eyes wide with hunger. They weren't violent, at least not yet, but their presence was a constant, gnawing terror. They waited, watching the living, knowing their time would come. One by one, the survivors succumbed to the curse. Some disappeared without a trace, while others were found drowned in their own homes, their faces frozen in terror, as if they had seen something far worse than death. Clearwater Bay is quiet now, but the curse still lingers. The town has never fully recovered, and those who live nearby say that on stormy nights, you can still hear the whispers of the drowned calling for those who betrayed them. And every hurricane season, as the winds pick up and the water rises, the people of the Gulf Coast know that the cursed hurricane waters could return at any time, ready to take more than just lives.